The Sultan of Granada, Muhammad XIII, known to his people as Al-Zagal, which meant the brave, was an astute military commander with a firm resolve. He studied the map and knew that the western part of his kingdom was now lost to the Castilians, who had taken the citadel of Ronda and then the vital port of Marbella. Al-Zagal was undeterred. He rallied his men. In late 1485, he launched one vicious attack after another. In 3 separate engagements, he crushed the Spaniards. At one point, his men even wounded the Count of Cabra near Alhama, and later they retook the city of Moclin, routing a Castilian army in the process. But now Al-Zagal was forced to turn his attention inward to another adversary. This time it would be his own nephew, Muhammad XII, also known as Boabdil. Boabdil had been released from captivity 3 years prior by Isabella and Ferdinand. As they predicted, the young sultan had gone on to incite a civil war with his uncle. But Al-Zagal was not going to tolerate his nephew for long. When opportunity presented itself, he attacked ferociously back, driving Boabdil from the Kingdom of Granada to the relative safety of Castilian lands in Murcia. The Sultan's prestige and his army grew. Only when the winter of 1485-86 came was there an end to his campaigning season. But Al-Zagal eagerly awaited the coming of spring to renew the attack on the Christians of the north, to pay back aggression with aggression. Ferdinand and Isabella welcomed the cessation in fighting. Their armies, as well as their treasury, were exhausted. What's more, on a much more personal level, they were anticipating a new arrival to the family. On December 16, 1485, Princess Catherine was born. She would be fated to be their youngest child, and she was truly adored. Ferdinand would bestow upon her his kingdom's namesake. This princess would be known as Catherine of Aragon, and in time she would ascend to the position of the Queen of England. But that is a great story unto itself. Isabella was delighted to have another daughter, and like with the rest of her children, she would instill Catherine with an incredible education and nurture her to have a very strong will. The Catholic monarch's joy at the birth of their new child, however, would be very short-lived. In early 1486, they received the unsettling news that Boabdil had gone back on his word. He was no longer going to be a vassal to Castile. Instead, he had made an alliance with Al-Zagal. The civil war between uncle and nephew was over, and now the Kingdom of Granada had been unified. As winter came to an end and spring began, Ferdinand mobilized his troops and Isabella mobilized the economy. The royal couple prepared for another year of war. In April of 1486, Ferdinand took the initiative and led his army to attack the fortress of Loja. This was the very same city where he had been defeated nearly 4 years before, but he had learned from his mistakes. This time he brought more caution, respect for his enemy, and to top it off, an absolutely massive contingent of artillery. Brian Catless, in his book Kingdoms of Faith, describes it really well. Quote, "The immense bombards that Ferdinand brought to the front, some of which were crewed by hundreds of soldiers and overseen by expert gunners from France and Italy, could open a breach in any wall, no matter how thick. And the taller the wall, the better the target. What had once been impregnable was now suddenly vulnerable." End quote. In May of 1486, the siege of Loja began. Boabdil, after asking his uncle for the assignment, was deployed to the city to take command, and there he put up a firm resistance. Ferdinand moved his men in and cautiously surrounded the city. His lumbering cannon were brought up, and over the next few days, they proceeded to reduce the immense city walls to rubble. The Spaniards advanced into the city, and after intense fighting, they occupied it. Eventually, only the citadel remained. From here, Boabdil continued to command his men. Ferdinand, however, moved up his cannon and brought this last Muslim refuge under bombardment. Boabdil was heavily injured in the crossfire, and by late May, with his city teetering on collapse, he was forced to surrender Loja. The defenders of the city, the few that were left, were allowed to honorably leave. Boabdil wasn't. He instead was taken captive by Isabella and Ferdinand again. To his people, Boabdil would now be known as Al-Zagal, the unlucky or the ill-fated. Ferdinand now pushed the offensive and intensified his attacks. Numerous Nasrid towns fell, including the strategic city of Mackula. Then, in June of 1486, the last city on the road to Granada, Illora, was taken after a determined defense. With this victory and a growing sense of hubris, the Aragonese king now ordered his men into the Vega of Granada to destroy the fertile lands that were there. But here, Al-Zagal awaited him with an ambush. The Sultan had brought together his cavalry and his elite warriors, concentrating them into a highly mobile, very effective fighting contingent, which he proceeded to launch into a surprise attack that took his enemy completely off guard. Ferdinand's men were forced back, sustaining heavy casualties. At a bridge over a tributary of the Rio Henal known as Pinos Puente, the Spaniards put up a last-ditch defense that managed to finally stop the Nasrids from advancing further, but this came at a very high cost. It became clear to Isabella and Ferdinand that the road to Granada was still too dangerous, especially with such a determined adversary as Al-Zagal. A new plan was needed. In September of 1486, Isabella and Ferdinand met with Boabdil to strike a new agreement. Boabdil was given the title Duke of Baza and Guadix in exchange for his loyalty and a commitment to be a vassal to Castile and Aragon once again. On September 15, 1486, he was released from captivity and returned to the emirate with Castilian military aid. Once Boabdil was back in his own land, he quickly organized his supporters, which included the powerful noble family, the Banu Sarraj. With his fighting force established, the young Boabdil led them to storm Granada. Fighting erupted everywhere in the streets of the capital. While Boabdil's men did manage to take the city, Al-Zagal maintained hold of the Alhambra, but this would require a considerable garrison of his best soldiers to hold the palace fortress. The Nasrid civil war had been reignited, and Al-Zagal now had to fight on two fronts once again. When word got back to Isabella and Ferdinand, they were overjoyed. Ferdinand jumped on this opportunity. He now picked one of the most challenging targets he could find. His army was now deployed to the city of Malaga. On April 7, 1487, Ferdinand moved out from Córdoba with an army of 20,000 soldiers, most of whom were cavalry. He also brought in an additional 8,000 support troops. His heavy artillery came up at the rear with a corps of engineers, leveling forests, paving roads, and building bridges to make way for their lumbering weight. On Easter Sunday, April 17, 1487, the Spanish army arrived at the coastal town of Valles Malaga, which needed to be taken as it lay on the approach to Malaga itself. At this point, Al-Zagal made the tough decision to divide his garrison at Granada in order to fight this incoming army. The Sultan quickly spotted Ferdinand's slow-moving artillery corps, which lagged behind the main army, and immediately deployed his fast-moving cavalry to destroy it. However, Ferdinand had wisely kept a protective contingent of men to protect the big guns, and had even gone so far as to order reinforcements under the command of the Marquis of Cadiz to move up. When Al-Zagal saw the incoming reinforcements, he called off the assault, but he wasn't done yet. He decided instead to use the element of surprise. The Sultan dispatched his elite renegados. The renegados, by the way, were Christian slaves converted to Islam at an early age and who were indoctrinated into the military, becoming impressive soldiers. The renegados were ordered to coordinate with the garrison in Valles Malaga for a combined night attack. However, the messenger that was sent was intercepted by the Castilians and confessed the entire plan. Meanwhile, Al-Zagal, who was unaware that this had happened, launched his attack anyway. On the night of April 25th, as the Nasrid forces moved into position to begin their assault, they stumbled into the center of the entire Spanish army which was waiting for them. Ferdinand had ordered them to remain silent and hidden in the darkness without fires. Suddenly, bonfires were lit, and the two armies erupted into savage fighting. The element of surprise had been reversed, and while the outnumbered Muslim army was able to hold its own throughout the night and well into the morning, the weight of numbers would eventually win out. Al-Zagal and his battered troops were driven off, and with no other reinforcements coming in, Valise Malaga would surrender on April 27, 1487. The Sultan had lost a major fight. His prestige plummeted, and the road to his best port, Malaga, was now open to Ferdinand. But for Al-Zagal, things were only going to get worse. As his wounded army limped its way from the battle, he got word that his garrison back in the Alhambra had defected to Boabdil's side, and thus Al-Zagal had also lost Granada. He was now forced to move on to Guadix, which would be his new capital. Back along the coast, Ferdinand and his army had already started to move on to Malaga. The Castilian navy would come in to provide close support as well. On May 7, 1487, the great port city came under siege. Hamid al-Zagri was the formidable commander of the Malaga garrison. His men consisted mainly of North African soldiers, with a sizable portion of the elite renegados. Ferdinand attempted numerous times to convince him to surrender, to which Hamid would repeatedly respond, "I was sent here to defend, not to surrender." For hundreds of years, Malaga was the greatest port city under Nasrid rule. Its defenses were remarkable. The thick city walls were dotted with towers and strongpoints. Inside was the nearly impregnable fortress of Gibralfaro, known then as the Rabita. On a nearby hill was the Al-Kazaba, the citadel. Hamid al-Zagri had used his time to reinforce the city and had expertly deployed his men. Now, it should be noted that both sides had cannons, but Ferdinand had brought bigger ones and in much greater quantity. His artillery assault began almost immediately. The Castilian navy would also sail in and close down the harbor. It would go so far as to shell the city from the water whenever opportunity presented itself. Over the next several days, the Christian army dug in, creating an extensive series of interconnected siege works. Malaga was soon cut off. However, despite this, resistance in the city only increased. When Ferdinand's cannons breached the outer walls, the Muslims retreated into the city, using their own cannons to inflict heavy casualties at point-blank range on any incoming Spanish attack. Hamid al-Zagri also masterfully concentrated his men into strong fighting contingents that would sally forth from the city to assault the besiegers, only to fall back to the Al-Kazaba to fight another day. In the midst of all this fighting, Boabdil sent a message reassuring Isabella and Ferdinand that he was committed to being their vassal, and that he would redouble his efforts to attack Al-Zagal. To his credit, Al-Zagal was able to send in some relieving forces to attack the siege works, but this effort was hamstrung by his nephew, who he'd have to fight as well. The siege of Malaga would drag on. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Castilian morale crumbled and Ferdinand's men began to desert en masse. Meanwhile, Ferdinand grew increasingly angry and impatient. He ordered the construction of siege towers and had his engineers build tunnels to undermine the walls. The Muslim defenders responded by destroying the incoming siege towers with their cannons and countermining the Castilian engineers, collapsing their tunnels and killing them in the process. As time went on, the fighting grew ever more savage. At one point, to boost morale, the Catholic Church even authorized that Muslim heads be paraded through the Christian camp. And Hamid al-Zagri authorized an assassination attempt on the king and queen, which in the end was unsuccessful, but the assassin did come very close to accomplishing his goal. By August of 1487, Ferdinand's men had captured portions of the outer wall. The defenders abandoned the city and retreated to their last line of defense, where they held on tenaciously, taunting the exhausted Christian soldiers whose morale had now reached a low point. For a brief time in that summer of 1487, it would seem that the siege was going to fail. The defenders were too well entrenched, and the resolve of the Spaniards was waning. Then Isabella and her court arrived at the siege. The sight of the Queen boosted morale as never before. She had used her logistical abilities to create baggage wagons, which brought in more supplies, and carried the sick and wounded back to hospital camps, which she had established. The Queen walked amongst her men, giving them courage, restoring their resolve with an almost maternal nature. The siege and the fighting would continue. By late August, the Muslim defenders were starving, and even their strong defensive positions were giving way to a seemingly endless artillery barrage. No reinforcements were coming in, no new supplies could make it into the city. And so, Hamid Al-Zagal finally had to go back on his word. On August 18, 1487, the city surrendered. Because the defenders had been so defiant and the siege had lasted so long, Ferdinand's fury at this point was unleashed. The entire population of the city was enslaved. Most of the garrison was executed. The elite renegados, who had caused a considerable amount of the destruction, were brought out of the city, chained to posts, and then used as live target practice. It was said of Hamid Al-Zagal that he was sent to the Pope as a present, later to die imprisoned in the dungeons of Rome. As for the Spanish soldiers who had deserted, they were rounded up, brought together, and simply burned at the stake for all to watch. With the capture of Malaga, the western part of the Kingdom of Granada was secured. It was now time to open another front. At the beginning of 1488, Al-Zagal held the cities of Baza, Guadix, and the last Nasrid port, Almeria. When the campaigning season began, Al-Zagal was once more on the warpath, but his focus wasn't geared so much against the Christians of the north, but rather against his nephew Boabdil, who was well positioned in Granada. This infighting of the Nasrid crippled both factions and gave Isabella and Ferdinand the chance to invade the eastern portion of the emirate. The Spanish army invaded from Murcia in June of 1488. Several smaller towns were taken, but when Ferdinand attacked Almeria, Al-Zagal showed that he still possessed mastery of the battlefield. Near Almeria, the Nasrid Sultan mustered his remaining strength and drove off Ferdinand's army. He then pursued the offensive. At a second engagement near Baza, Al-Zagal, personally leading his men, annihilated a portion of this invading force. Ferdinand was forced to retreat, and once again he had to rethink his strategy. The next year, the Aragonese king would return, but he brought much greater strength and his impressive artillery corps. In June of 1489, the city of Baza would come under siege. Much like Malaga, Baza was a powerful fortress, and thus the siege would have to be an extensive one. Ferdinand encircled the city, put up his siege works, and brought his big guns to bear. Unlike at Malaga, at Baza there was a newfound determination amongst his men. Kirsten Downey in The Warrior Queen explains, quote, "By 1489, the Castilian troops encamped around Baza had become a cohesive fighting force. High morale was evident to everyone. The soldiers came from all different parts of Spain, from Asturias, from Galicia, from the Basque Country, and joined with the Castilians and the Aragonese. They all spoke different dialects, but nonetheless got along surprisingly well. They were united in a sense of combined purpose. They were becoming a nation now organized under a religious banner." End quote. Boabdil, meanwhile, deciding that this was his uncle's city, simply did nothing to help the defenders. Al-Zagal saw the strength and the resolve of his opponent, and he knew he lacked the force to attack the besiegers. Despite this, The siege dragged on for months. The cost of fielding so many soldiers in this siege, along with the fighting forces on other fronts, was astronomical. It bankrupted Ferdinand and Isabella's treasury. In fact, halfway through the siege, Isabella had to pawn her own jewelry in order to pay for the war. In November of 1489, Isabella came to Baza to show her commitment to the siege. Her mere presence and the reputation of how she cared for her soldiers like they were her own children caused morale to soar. At the very same time, the sight of the queen walking amongst her troops caused Muslim morale in the city to crash. A message under truce soon arrived at Isabella's doorstep. The garrison was ready to surrender. With the queen present, the people of Baza felt that the terms of surrender would be much more merciful. Nobody wanted a repeat of the aftermath of Malaga. And so, on December 4th, 1489, the city officially lowered its flags. Al-Zagal took the loss of Baza especially hard. He was a fighter, nobody could say otherwise. But strategically, he knew his war was over. In late December, he approached Ferdinand and Isabella, at which time he ceded Guadix and later Almeria, selling everything he owned in Andalusia for 20,000 Castellanos. The Sultan was given the option to stay in Al-Andalus, but he was not willing to bear this indignation. He still possessed his sense of valor. Al-Zagal departed across the sea to the Maghreb of North Africa. He was never again to set foot in Iberia. The Arab chronicler Nujat al-Asir would say of his crossing, quote, "Many people assert that Al-Zagal and his commanders sold these villages and districts to the ruler of Castile just to receive a price for them. But all this was done with a view of taking revenge on the son of his brother. By his action, he wanted to cut off Granada so as to destroy it in the way that the rest of the country had been destroyed." End quote. The Kingdom of Granada was now just the city of Granada, where Boabdil sat on a throne in the Alhambra, surrounded by an overwhelming enemy determined to bring him down. Ironically enough, it was at this point that he became determined to fight to the end. In 1490, the armies of Christendom moved in to tighten the noose amidst weakening Nasrid resistance. The Emirates still had the ability to conduct a few raids, but little else. Food and supplies were running low, yet Boabdil continued to fight. Ferdinand and Isabella came again in 1491. This time, instead of taking smaller towns, their goal was the capital itself. In April of that year, a massive siege line was established around Granada. All roads leading into the city were cut off, and there were no more ports to bring in supplies or reinforcements. Every day as the inhabitants of Granada would wake up, they would witness new siege works being assembled. Ferdinand had perfected the art of encirclement. Boabdil sent out desperate requests to the nations of North Africa for help. None responded. The Sultan's own vizier, Abu al-Qasim Abd al-Malik, approached him and stated that the capital only had a few months of food left, but Boabdil was undeterred. He ordered his men to hold the line. Indeed, the Muslim elite cavalry would emerge from the Alhambra to challenge their Spanish rivals in individual combat. The Christian knights seeking glory would engage them, but at the gates of the Alhambra, the Nasrid would prove superior in one-to-one combat. Ferdinand had to ban this practice as so many of his esteemed knights were being killed. The siege of the capital would drag on for several months. Inside the city, the situation was becoming desperate. The inhabitants of Granada put their last faith that the coming winter would force the Christian forces to withdraw. But this belief was soon shattered. Brian Catless explains, quote, In 1491, Ferdinand and Isabella began to assemble a massive siege camp known as Santa Fe, virtually a city in itself below the walls of Granada. There could be little doubt as to how the war would end, and scores of Christian glory seekers poured in, emboldened by the guarantee of victory and the patina of moral vindication provided by the Crusade bull. In the city itself, the inhabitants now resigned themselves to their fate. They appointed a committee to negotiate the best possible terms of surrender. But unbeknownst to all, Boabdil had opened up his own secret negotiations aimed at achieving the best possible outcome for himself. End quote. In November of 1491, the terms of surrender had been written. The final capitulation of the city would come on Epiphany, January 6, 1492. However, Boabdil worried that when word got out that he had made his own deal, insurrection would follow, so the final date was set a few days earlier. On January 1, 1492, the last sultan of the last kingdom of Islam in the Reconquista ceremoniously handed over the keys of the city. 781 years of Muslim rule in Iberia was now gone forever. Boabdil departed the Alhambra, arriving at a small bridge. As the story goes, which could be simply apocryphal, the Sultan turned back to see his beloved city one last time. He sighed and began to cry on what would later be known as the Bridge of Sighs. As the story continues, Boabdil's mother, the formidable Fatima, would scold him and say, "Do not weep as a woman for what you could not defend as a man." The Sultan, like his uncle, was given the option to stay, but he was not able to tolerate this for long. Eventually, he would take ship and depart. He left Iberia and traveled across the sea to North Africa. As it was recorded, Boabdil was to remain forever in exile and would later die in the city of Fez in 1533. He was never to see his beautiful capital again. Back in Granada, on January 2, 1492, Isabella and Ferdinand, wearing the clothing style of those that they had just conquered, entered the Alhambra to celebrate the Christian Mass. Their great war was finally over. In a nearby hill of the Alhambra, their soldiers discovered caves that had been converted into dungeons, which had held over 7,000 Christian slaves. Only 1,500 were alive at the time of their liberation. The royal couple saw to it personally that these survivors were nourished back to health. The Reconquista had finally come to an end. Downey puts it well, quote, "The victory over Granada won acclaim for Isabella and Ferdinand throughout Europe. It was the first significant triumph against Islam in hundreds of years, and to many Europeans, it was partial payback for the loss of Constantinople. Ferdinand moved quickly to make sure he was given full credit for the achievement. He would say, 'We desire you to know that it has pleased our Lord to give complete victory to the king and destruction to the kingdom of Granada and to the foes of our Catholic faith. After many labors, costs, deaths, and much shedding of our subjects' blood, on 2nd January of this year of grace, 1492, you have here a Catholic land.'" End quote. One chapter in history had come to a close, but the story would not end here. Isabella had definitively seen to that. She had already started the process of weaponizing religious indoctrination. On one end, it was time, as the esteemed Professor Hugh Kennedy would say, to bid farewell to Al-Andalus. A nation, a people, a religion had been conquered in Iberia, but the process of assimilation had only begun. And in that endeavor, Isabella was driven to prove that resistance would be futile.